The Winter Line operations, lasting from November 15, 1943 to January 15, 1944, continued the Allied campaign to drive the Germans out of southern Italy. The underlying plan was to keep pressure on the enemy and, if possible, to break through toward Rome. Both the terrain and the season reduced the chances for effecting a breakthrough. By maintaining pressure, however, the Allies would prevent the Germans from resting and refitting the tired and depleted divisions which they might hold as a mobile reserve for the close defense of Rome in the event of a new Allied landing on the west coast or for use in a possible counteroffensive in the opening months of 1944. Then, too, the fighting in Italy had its effects on the overall military situation in Europe. As long as the Germans were actively engaged on the Italian front, they would be forced to feed in men and supplies which would otherwise be available for the war in Russia or for strengthening their Atlantic wall against an expected Allied invasion in 1944. Continuation of the Italian campaign was not in question. The problem was how best to carry it on. The Allied effort was therefore maintained in an offensive plan to break the enemy's Winter Line, a series of well-prepared positions along the shortest possible line across the waste of Italy from the Garigliano River on the west through mountains in the center to the Sangro River on the east. For the individual soldiers of the Fifth Army, the attack resolved itself into the familiar pattern of bitter fighting from hill to hill. The Allied armies had reached the Winter Line as a result of operations which began early September 1943. On September 3, the British Eighth Army, under General, now Field Marshal, Sir Bernard L. Montgomery, began to drive up the toe of Italy. The U.S. Fifth Army, under Lieutenant General Mark W. Clark, struck the main blow on September 9 by landing at Salerno. The German forces in the peninsula at that time were widely scattered, for the enemy high command could not be sure of our plan of attack and also had to safeguard rear lines of communications made uncertain by the Italian armistice. Confronted by these problems, the Germans managed to hold us below Naples until their troops could evacuate the south. Thereafter they retreated up the boot of Italy, yielding the port of Naples and the airfields at Foggia, but skillfully delaying us wherever the terrain favored a temporary stand. Their chief holding effort had been made on the Volturno River, which Fifth Army crossed successfully the night of 12/October 13. As the Germans resumed their forced withdrawal, the Eighth Army on the right and the Fifth Army on the left drove steadily forward. Our push up the west coast, however, grew increasingly difficult as winter approached. The fall rains, which had begun early in October with unusual force, slowed down our advance. On the vital supply routes, flooded streams washed out temporary bridges, built hastily to take the place of the hundreds of spans blown by the enemy. Vehicles and men had to struggle through deep mud, and morale declined as rain continued to pour down from leaden skies. From the damaged port of Naples to forward units battling on precipitous hills, the entire supply chain creaked under the burdens imposed by demolitions and bad weather. Worst of all was the lack of reserve divisions, for without fresh troops to exploit a possible breakthrough. Fifth Army had to rely on cautious tactics. The troops grew weary, and they had no hope of immediate relief. Early in November, the German 14 Panzer Corps, which had been holding on with barely enough troops to man the line, was strengthened by 2 divisions. At the same time, our advance elements reached the outskirts of a strong line of fortifications on the Garigliano River and in the mountains to the northeast. Our momentum, already affected by wheatl terrain, and supply problems, was first slowed and then stopped by the tenacious enemy defense in this area. The drive, which began at Salerno, came to a temporary halt by November 15. It was time for the Allies to reorganize and consolidate their gains in preparation for an attack against the enemy's well-prepared positions. By the end of October, German prisoners of war were talking vaguely about their Wintertel/Ungen or winter positions, which were being prepared by reserves and forced civilian labor to the rear of their immediate front. In that month, on the basis of the successful delaying action in progress, the German High Command apparently had decided that our forces could be held south of Rome for the winter. The enemy had therefore set about the construction of a defensive line from the Tyrrhenian Sea straight across to the Adriatic. Conflicting reports at first made it difficult to determine the exact course of this line, and the subsequent fighting showed that not one but 2 systems of fortifications awaited Fifth Army troops. The main positions, making up the Gustav or Casino Line, began at the Tyrrhenian coast, ran along the Garigliano River, then up the west bank of the Rapido River to the heights above Casino. Here the Germans planned to halt us definitely, but in front of Casino, to protect the work of Fortify Cation and to gain time, they had constructed a system of temporary positions which eventually was called the Winter Line proper. Hinging on the Garigliano River 10 miles from the sea, the system extended northeast through the hills, barring access to the Rapido Valley into the high Apennines where neither side could operate in force. Though this forward line was planned only to delay us, the success of the enemy in stopping our advance units at its approaches in the first part of November led to a decision to hold it as long as possible before falling back to the main defenses. However temporary in original plan, the Winter Line presented a formidable barrier to General Clark's army. It was a succession of interlocked defenses in depth, and no single key position presented an opportunity for a brilliant stroke that could break the entire system. Each mountain had to be taken, each valley cleared, and then there were more mountains ahead and still another main defense line to be broken. In 8th Army's zone, what was called the Winter Line was not a series of strong forward positions but the main belt of defenses on which the Germans planned to hold after mid-November. The Sangre River, from its mountain headwaters to the Adriatic, served as a natural barrier in front of this system. During the period up to mid-November, 5th Army had delivered the main attack in the Italian campaign and had, as a result, drawn against itself the bulk of the enemy forces. If the weight of Allied effort was suddenly shifted now to 8th Army on the East Coa 5T, there was a chance to surprise the enemy. Upon this chance the plans of General, now Field Marshal, Sir Harold R. 1. G. Alexander, commanding 15th Army Group, were based. 5th Army was ordered to halt and to reorganize in preparation for an attack about 30 November BER. 8th Army was meanwhile to begin an attack up the east coast toward Ortona. On reaching this area, 8th Army was to swing west on Highway No. 5 toward Rome. This threat to the rear of the main German forces engaged by 5th Army might compel the enemy to pull back well north of Rome. 8th Army, in accordance with these plans, began to regroup its forces for an attack through the Winter Line on the lower Sangro River and jumped off on the night of 19/November 20th. It was immediately engaged in heavy fighting by the enemy, who contested every yard of the hills overlooking the river. Shortly after 8th Army began its part of the operation, 5th Army moved forward to break the Winter Line south of the Apennines. Plans for this attack had been underway since October and had been frequently changed, but they all revolved about the necessity of smashing through the forward defenses of the enemy so as to place our troops at the entrance of the Liri Valley. Rome would thus be threatened from the Wooth by General Clark's forces and from the east BV 8th Army. Less than 8 miles in front of the center of 5th Army lay the beginning of the Liri Valley, the gateway to Rome, and the ultimate objective of the coming attack. The gateway, however, has all the defensive advantages that nature can bestow. To the south, it is flanked by steep mountains which border the western side of the Garigliano River all the way from the sea to the bend of that river into the Liri Valley. Near the Garigliano mouth, a floodplain 5 miles wide lies on the eastern side of the stream. Attack across this plain, toward dominating hills behind a river barrier, would be exceedingly difficult. Near the center of 5th Army's sector the terrain presented opportunities and problems of a different order. Map number 3, page 9. Leaving the Volturno Plains, Highway No. 6 follows a natural corridor through the north-south mountain barrier. Near Mignano the corridor narrows to a mile-wide gap, 600 to 700 feet above sea level. South of it lies the hill mass of Mount Camino, about 3,000 feet high. Even higher ridges tower to the north. Just beyond the Mignano Gap, as the valley begins to widen out again toward the Rapido River plain, 2 small but prominent hills lie athwart the corridor. Rising 600 feet above the valley floor, Mount Rotondo and Mount Lungo resemble natural stoppers, obstructing exit from the mountains. As a final hurdle, troops attempting to debouch into the Rapido Valley would find themselves facing 2 isolated hills, Mount Porcia, 850 feet, and Mount Tracchio, 1,400 feet. which lie directly on the approach to Cassino and flank the plain leading across the Rapido River into the Liri Valley. On the right flank of Fifth Army, a wedge of rough mountain upland widens north from Mount Samucro to the main ridge of the Apennines, effectively protecting the approach to the Liri Valley from the north via the Rapido Valley. Dominated by peaks nearing the 4,000-foot level, this region of bare knobs and brush-covered swells is scantily inhabited and poorly provided with natural routes of advance. Only two roads, one from Filignano to San Elia and the other from Colli to Atina, penetrate the desolate country. Both roads are narrow and tortuous and are dominated everywhere by the hills. Along the whole Fifth Army front, German engineers made very skillful use of terrain and fortifications to hold our forces back. They laid mines on the roads and trails, at the heads of gullies, and in the natural cross-country approaches. All bridges and culverts were destroyed, and sites for bypasses were mined. Machine gun and mortar emplacements, many of them dug 4 or 5 feet into solid rock, covered nearly every path. Not even intense artillery concentrations could smash these positions. On the slopes of mountains, behind stream beds, and across narrow valleys, dozens of mutually supporting machine guns were sighted to weave a deadly pattern of cross-fire. As a result of these defenses, small forces of the enemy could hold the gullies, draws, and difficult trails that led into the mountains, even in the face of strong attacks. Where terrain features were not sufficient barriers to military movement, the Germans constructed strongpoints, especially in the relatively flat land of the Mignano Gap. 1,500 yards northwest of Mignano, for example, a minefield guarded an important trail north of a creek bed. Beyond the mines was first a belt of concertina wire, 50 to 75 feet deep, then log and earth bunkers, which provided cover for riflemen and served as blocks against armor. This strongpoint, hastily prepared in October or early November, was well supported by machine guns placed on the slopes of neighboring heights. Although only about 500 yards long, it covered one of the few open spaces in the valley. The winter line depended primarily on defenses of this type. Concrete and steel pillboxes were not met by our troops until they had driven to the Gustav Line. Although the Germans' main concern was to control the dominating mountains in the path of the Fifth Army, they also used the few small towns on the mountain slopes for organized defense and delaying tactics. The Italian houses, built of solid masonry, could be transformed into effective strongpoints, forcing us in many cases to reduce by artillery fire or by street fighting a town which otherwise might have been bypassed. Demolitions, mines, and booby traps were used to full effect in delaying tactics afforded by the village fortresses. Enemy howitzers and long-range guns, often self-propelled and well defiladed behind protecting crests, could reach nearly every area held by the Allied troops. The trails and roads they had to use, bivouac sites, and the front lines were all subjected to harassing fires. Peaks, such as Camino and Samucro, provided posts from which enemy forward observers could see every movement made by our forces in daylight. Rain, snow, and fog limited visibility much of the time, but still most of our movements had to take place under cover of darkness. Behind the mountain barrier, on the other hand, the Germans could supply their troops with relative ease and could maneuver almost at will to reinforce the comparatively small detachments that manned individual defenses. After November 18th, Fifth Army was made up of 3 corps. British 10 Corps, with the 46 and 56 divisions, controlled the high ground east of the Garigliano Valley for a distance of 15 miles from the sea. Then the British line left the valley and skirted the eastern edge of the imposing Camino Hill mass, meeting the U.S. 2 Corps sector just south of Mignano. 2 Corps, composed of the 3D and 36 divisions, held a 5-mile front across the corridor followed by Highway No-6 on its way toward Cassino starting at the lower slopes on the shoulder of the Camino Mountains. The Corps positions neared the foot of Mount Lungo, then crossed the highway to include Mount Rotondo and Canavanel Hill 6 Corps sector, with nearly 15 miles of front. Started at the low saddle connecting Canavanel with Mount Samucro. Beyond, the 45th Division held hard-won positions along the eastern slopes of Samucro and on high ground above Vinafro. North of Pozzilli, The 34th Division's outposts lay in rough upland along the Pazzi the 3rd Road and north to the Army boundary near Castel San Vincenzo. 5th Army was opposed by 5 enemy divisions, under 14 Panzer Corps. The 94th Infantry Division held the enemy right flank facing British 10 Corps along the Garigliano. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division held the sector on the left of the 94th to within a mile of Mignano. The zone between Mignano and Venafro was occupied after November 17 by the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division. From Venafro to Filignano, the line was held at the end of November by the 44th Grenadier Division, and the enemy's left flank, from Filignano on into the 8th Army Zone, was defended by the 305th Grenadier Division. After the Allied offensive began early in December, the enemy reinforced his line, first by elements of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division at the Mignano Gap and then in the middle of the month by units of the 5th Mountain Division west of Filignano. Though our offensive wore down several units to remnants of their former strength, the Germans resisted bitterly under direct orders from the Führer to hold their ground. The 5th Army attack orders divided the operation into 3 phases. The first was a blow on the left of the Mignano Gap to capture the Camino Hill Mass. Then would come a thrust at the Samucro Heights on the right of the gap, supported by a simultaneous penetration along the 2 east-west roads on the north flank, and in the third phase the main attack was to drive into the Liri Valley. British 10 Corps on the left flank was to capture part of the Camino feature during the first phase, as well as to make a feint along the lower Garigliano River. U.S. 2 Corps was to carry out the offensive in the Mignano Gap sector. 6 Corps had the task of pushing through the mountains towards Sant Elia and Atina, with the high ground north and northwest of Cassino as its ultimate objective. Plans had also been laid for the introduction of French troops into the Italian theater. The 2D Moroccan Infantry Division arrived at Naples by December 1st, and the 3D Algerian Infantry Division was scheduled to arrive at the end of the month. Both divisions had been trained in mountain fighting, and both were eager to vindicate the old glory of French arms. With the addition of these 2 divisions and the U.S. 1st Armored Division, which came to Italy in November, 5th Army would have 9 divisions for the grueling drive which lay ahead.